Trump threatens BRICS, major consequences ahead, dollar in danger. What could happen now? The current geopolitical landscape has brought forth some interesting developments, and a number of significant stories are shaping the conversation around global economics and foreign policy. Among the most notable are the comments from Donald Trump, who has vowed to impose 100% tariffs on BRICS nations if they attempt to move away from the US dollar. Alongside this, Marco Rubio has voiced some critical opinions that underscore the complexity of the ongoing war in Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Romanian government has issued a statement of support for Ukraine, following controversial remarks from a far-right presidential candidate. Let's begin with Trump's statements on the BRICS countries. He made a bold declaration, threatening to slap 100% tariffs on any BRICS nations that try to either create their own currency or back another currency instead of the US dollar. Trump made it clear that if these nations attempted such moves, they would be excluded from accessing the US economy, pushing them to seek markets elsewhere. While this is a harsh and aggressive stance, the language Trump used raises concerns. Specifically, his reference to these nations as sucker nations was a poor choice. By labeling other nations this way, he implies that any country allowing the US to hold financial dominance is somehow naive or foolish. In reality, this creates a contradiction because, under the same logic, every country in the world that has allowed the US to control the global financial system could be seen as a sucker nation. This is a dangerous oversimplification and an unfortunate phrasing that only adds fuel to the fire. Trump also referred to the BRICS countries as hostile nations, which is an interesting choice of words. But why are these countries considered hostile? Is it really because of their actions, or is it because of how the US government has positioned itself through its aggressive sanctions and the weaponization of the dollar? Over the years, the US has used economic sanctions as a foreign policy tool, which has led to a growing distrust of the US dollar. The BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, along with several other nations around the world, are now exploring alternatives to the dollar. This shift in global trade is not just some impulsive decision, it's a reaction to the instability caused by US policies, particularly the sanctions imposed on Russia. These nations now realize that the dollar, while still dominant, can be weaponized against them at any moment, making it an unreliable currency for long-term transactions. This is why they are exploring other options. Before the conflict in Ukraine escalated, the US dollar was trusted globally. But since the imposition of sweeping sanctions on Russia, such as disconnecting it from the SWIFT system and freezing its foreign assets, the world has started questioning the security of the dollar. Countries are beginning to wonder if they hold US dollars, are they truly theirs? The answer is troubling. They are essentially leasing the dollar as it could be seized or devalued at the US government's discretion. This is precisely why nations are looking for alternatives. Russia's example of being cut off from international financial systems served as a wake-up call for many countries, signaling the vulnerability of relying on a currency that could be rendered useless with a single stroke of a pen. This trend of de-dollarization is gaining momentum, and while it may be possible for the US to reverse it, it would require major shifts in policy. For starters, lifting sanctions on Russia, especially those that affect the dollar, would be a crucial step in rebuilding trust in the US financial system. The US has the ability to stop using the dollar as a weapon, but whether it will do so is another question. It's important to recognize that Trump's tactics, such as threatening tariffs, may not be effective with major economies like China or India. These countries are too economically significant to be easily sidelined, and a move like this would hurt the US just as much as it would hurt them. For the US to succeed in reasserting its power, it will need to abandon these heavy-handed tactics and rethink its strategy. Trump's statement that BRICS will never replace the US dollar is overly dismissive. The fact that he is speaking so strongly about it indicates that he knows there is a real chance of the dollar being replaced in international trade. If there were no real threat, he wouldn't waste his time discussing it. The US is trying to reassert its financial dominance, but the rise of BRICS as a global economic bloc is changing the landscape, and these old tactics won't work as effectively against such powerful nations. Trump's rhetoric around imposing tariffs and forcing nations to say goodbye to America if they challenge the dollar might sound like a forceful solution, but it's not as simple as it seems. While some countries might feel the pressure and back down, the US would ultimately feel the negative effects as well. For one, it would likely drive inflation higher in the US, which already struggles with one of the largest national debts in the world. Inflation is the last thing the US needs right now, especially when countries are increasingly looking for alternatives to the dollar. If enough countries adopt alternative currencies, the US could face serious economic consequences. The US can apply these aggressive tactics selectively, targeting smaller nations with less economic leverage. But when it comes to major players like China or India, the situation becomes much more complicated. These countries represent a significant portion of global trade, and any attempts to isolate them would only backfire, hurting the US economy and further accelerating the process of de-dollarization. Now let's turn to Marco Rubio's comments on the war in Ukraine. He acknowledged the protracted nature of the conflict and pointed out that it is getting worse as Ukraine continues to lose territory. He suggested that even members of his own party, including Democrats, should be willing to admit that the situation has taken a turn for the worse. Rubio, however, also pointed out that the Kremlin's actions are deplorable, though he argued that the US and the West have made their own mistakes in this conflict. But I would argue that the actions of the West, particularly those of the EU, were not mistakes at all. Rather, they were a calculated attempt to permanently assert the EU's position as the dominant political and economic force in Europe. Over the past few years, the EU has positioned itself as the voice of Europe, sidelining individual countries' positions. The US, on the other hand, has been focused on weakening Russia as a strategic adversary, which has brought in substantial financial and military resources to this ongoing war. Rubio criticized the false narrative that Ukraine could not only defeat Russia, but also push them back to their pre-2014 borders. He emphasized that the Western world needs to face reality. Ukraine will not regain all of its lost territory. Rubio's statement was aimed directly at the European Union and other Western powers who continue to push for these unrealistic goals. His comments reflect the growing divide between the US and its European allies over the way forward in Ukraine. Finally, we turn to the Romanian government's statement of support for Ukraine, which came in response to comments made by a far-right presidential candidate. The Romanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs reaffirmed its unwavering support for Ukraine's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. This statement was issued in the face of Ukrainian criticism of the far-right candidate's remarks, which they accused of aligning with Russian propaganda. However, it's worth noting that the Romanian government, not its people, has been responsible for providing military aid to Ukraine, including the deployment of Patriot missile batteries. The Romanian people were not consulted in this decision, and the support has come from the government alone. In conclusion, while the Romanian people have been supportive of Ukraine, particularly during the war, the government's foreign policy has been driven by broader geopolitical considerations. This illustrates the tension between government policy and public sentiment, a dynamic that is seen in many countries supporting Ukraine through official channels, while the public may not fully agree with the actions taken.